Good evening, and welcome to the Crossroads of Ideas Democratizing Data event. I'm Brian Bockelman. I'm an investigator here at the Morgridge Institute for Research, which is one of the research institutes here at the Discovery Building. My background is as a computer scientist, and they always like to say that if the subject puts the word science in it, then it's not a real science. But the good news is we have some wonderful people I'm going to introduce, Margaret and Cameron, who are really essential parts of the scientific effort. Margaret's part of the Joe Handelsman lab here within the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And Cameron comes from the libraries part of the campus. So while some of us try to toil away at one piece of science, Cameron's work affects thousands of faculty across campus. So today's event marks the final installment of the 2024 Crossroads of Ideas program. This program is a collaboration between the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery's Illuminating Discovery Hub, UW-Madison, and the Morgridge Institute for Research. It's an opportunity to foster dialogue between the community and local scientists, and the series addresses issues that impact all of us and highlights important research happening here on campus and across the state. Since 2014, Crossroads has been a staple of the public programming offered here at the Discovery Building at UW-Madison, and I'd like to welcome everybody here. It's great to have you. Before I say anything more about this evening's event, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that we occupy here at the Discovery Building, the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed, where both the federal and state governments tried repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. The history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison and all today's presenting organizations respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Yeah, we're making progress. Everybody hold your breath. Great, I was about to have to go without, then you guys would have been in real trouble. I want to talk about scientific data today. And not just scientific data, that's stuff that we collect as scientists, whether it's from out in the lab, whether it's out sensor data, whether it's coming from satellites, or coming from surveys and filling in from people around the world, that data that we use to help drive hypothesis-driven science and to try to make discoveries and advance our research. Scientific data, to help with this program, I like to think of it two types. There's data, again, the things that we collect. Margaret's gonna show you some wonderful things that are in the boxes here, or at least how she uses the boxes. And then there's metadata. There's the data about data. And while it might kind of the latter sound boring, the metadata is actually some of the really interesting aspects of this, because this is how scientists communicate about what they have, what they do, and how they share and talk about what they've gathered. And so, of course, we're here to answer one of the great questions about sharing scientific data, which is, why is this any different than sharing pictures of our cats on Facebook, right? Scientists, they think they're so smart. We share cats all the time. Why is doing this with science anything harder? And why do we need anything but Facebook in order to do and share our science? So with that framing in mind, a little more on the serious side, I think of science and society as being in an important relationship. Society makes really significant investments. If you look at whether it's funding or time or energy, sometimes it's as simple as taxpayer dollars, into the work of the scientific community and people like what go on this campus. And in return, on the other side of that relationship, it's really important that science provides some trustworthy results that we think have some benefit back to the society that provides the investments. And to some extent, that's a social contract. It's a give and take. And on the scientific side, in order to keep trustworthy, there's questions about who gets access to the data. Can society at large get access to the data? Do we understand how this was analyzed and used? Between one complete side of the data was born and the other it was published, what goes on in the middle? This is valuable. This takes a lot of resources. Can we preserve the data for future generations or even the next scientist down the line? There's a lot of hard questions about taking the work of one lab and making it available and giving back to the society that helped fund it. One organizational principle for this is what we like to call FAIR. So it's one of these fun acronyms that also sounds clever. So the FAIR principles are one way we approach making the data available to others, to the public, to general society. And the four parts of the acronym are findable. Once we've created the data, can somebody else discover that it exists? Can we even know that there is a data set that we should go talk to somebody or know about? Once found, can it be easily accessed? Can you actually download the data and get it in your hands? Can you look at the pictures of the climate data? Can you read the paper that might have been published? Interoperable. Can we actually take the data and make use of it? Can we combine it together? Can we look at the other studies? Can we run it through a computer program and do analysis and think about it? And then finally, the ultimate goal along the lines of these FAIR principles is, can we make the data be reusable? Can we take it and reuse of other scientific results? And can we continue to extract value and make that serve society? So the two folks that are going to talk this evening, first will be Margaret. And I'd say she is the scientist down in the trenches. She's part of the Handelsman lab. And she's going to talk a little bit, not just about the science she does, but the real life cycle. What is the day in the life of a scientist and the scientific data that they collect? And then after Margaret, we're going to talk a little bit from Cameron about these FAIR principles again. So we take a step back from that individual lab. How do we follow these principles? How do we preserve the data for future generations? And how does the library fit within the picture? So without further ado here, and hopefully without breaking PowerPoint, I'm going to hand it off to Margaret. Thanks.
Yay. So as Brian said, my name is Margaret Thairu, and I have been really lucky in my career to work with lots of different types of data. So I've been able to go out in the field and collect specimens. I've chased bees in alfalfa fields. I've also worked in the lab looking at animal behavior, as well as looking at playing with molecular kind of data as well. And now I'm playing more with computational data. And so the goal of my little segment is that I hope at the end that I've convinced you that scientific data, or at least shown how scientific data is a little bit more complicated and harder to share than really cute photos of cats on Facebook. So to start, I thought we'd start with a question. And the question is, what do we think of when we think about scientific data? What are some of the things that immediately come to mind? So when I was trying to answer this question, I thought, really, it's figures and graphs. That's the first thing that pops into my mind when someone says data. But then also thought about it a little bit more, and I thought, oh, tables, Excel sheets. That's getting a little bit more tangible, right? Now you're getting numbers and more information. But then, since we're all scientists, the main means that we tend to share data, and maybe that's the way that we think about it, is through publications. Now, all of these all of these versions of data are all valid, but I think they're very one-dimensional. They're very flat. They don't really show us the true complexity and the true three-dimensionality that goes behind how do we get a paper in the end? What goes into making all those figures? And so to help us understand some more of the complexity and the three-dimensional nature of data, it's helpful to think about the life cycle of data. So data, much like us humans, goes through birth, growth, development, and change, and then old age, and we slowly make way for the next generation. But for data, it's a little bit more cyclical, like Brian mentioned. We kind of want it to be reused so it doesn't die. And so one of the advantages of thinking about data in this cyclical way is that it helps highlight the fact that at every single point that we're moving to the next stage, a researcher or a scientist has to make a decision. And that decision ends up influencing the ultimate shape and form of the data. And those decision points, the researcher has to weigh pros and cons of short-term trying to answer the question at hand and the long-term benefits and thinking about the future and the long-term consequences of the data that we generate. So let's begin at the beginning, at birth. So how is data born, or how does it come up? I like to think of data being born with an idea, a question, a niggling feeling of like, is that really how that works? Or I'm pretty sure that I think I understand how that goes. And so from those really broad questions, we start to create our hypotheses. And those hypotheses end up shaping our experiments that are the vehicle that we start to collect our data. And so to help us travel through the life cycle of data, I thought I would select one of the projects that are ongoing in the Handelsman lab. One moment. Okay. And that's the Be Well project. So the Behavior Biology and Wellbeing project. So in this project, the main question, or one of the things that we're trying to understand, is depression. Now, depression is one of the most widespread mental health concerns that we have. And if you look at depression worldwide, it's actually one of the leading causes of disability. And not only does it impact the person who's suffering from depression, but it also has societal impacts as well. Now, the two main ways that we have of trying to treat depression are antidepressants and types of therapy. Now, there are pros and cons to both of these. If we start with antidepressants, the biggest challenge that we have with antidepressants is they often don't work. Now, when you go into the doctor's office and you're prescribed an antidepressant, about 60% of the time, that first prescription just won't work. And then you have to go through this very frustrating process of changing the type of antidepressant or maybe changing the dosage. And throughout this whole time, a person might be suffering with these symptoms and dealing with adverse side effects. And then to top it all off, that dosage and that prescription might stop working, and you have to start the cycle all over again. Now, the other method that we have of dealing with depression symptoms is therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and such. Now, while this is very helpful, it's not very accessible. And so that's the main barrier that we have with therapy-based interventions. So here within Be Well, we're trying to maybe address this need that exists. How can we better help and deal with depression? And so the aspect that we're focusing on are mindfulness-based types of intervention. Now, when I say mindfulness, you might immediately think of yoga or breathing techniques and meditation. And all of those things are exactly right. Mindfulness, one way of defining it, is being present in that moment. And it's been shown that mindfulness-based therapies, so in-person intensive cognitive behavioral therapy, can actually be as effective as antidepressants as in stopping major depressive episodes. Now, the reason why we're really interested in understanding mindfulness in the context of depression is because it can be, the intervention can be given in a remote way, so via an app. So we're getting past that hurdle of accessibility. And so here we want to ask, is it possible to use a mobile app to help with depression symptoms? Now, Be Well has a third aspect, which is the microbiome. Specifically, we're talking about the microbes that inhabit our gut. Now, you might have heard in media that there is this gut-brain axis, and that's absolutely right. And there is this, the gut-brain axis is this bidirectional communication that occurs with the microbes in our gut and our brain. Now, one of the studies that I think really elegantly shows the effect that microbes have on our brain is one that was done in 2016, where they took stool samples or microbiome samples from depressed patients. They transferred them into rats that had their own microbiome removed via antibiotics. And what they found was that these rats ended up displaying depressed behavior, showing that the microbiome can directly affect your mental health. So overall, with Be Well, what we're trying to understand is this relationship that occurs between depression, mindfulness, and the microbiome. And whether a mindfulness app that's delivered, mindfulness intervention that's delivered remotely can have an effect on the depression symptoms, and whether the microbiome may be acting as a mediator between them, and maybe explaining if we see an effect, that might be how that mindfulness might be acting through changes in the microbiome. Now, this study is a human-facing study. We are recruiting human subjects. And so in part of the planning stage, the first step of data lifecycle, such studies like this need to go through IRB approval. So that's the board on campuses that go through your study design and ensure that your study not only protects and respects your participants, but meets the ethical standards. And if it doesn't, then you have to go back and reassess your study design so that the participants are protected and respected throughout. So once our study went through IRB approval and we've gone through that first step of the planning stage. So what comes next? Next comes the collection and the processing. So if we break down Be Well into its three components, we can start with the depression side. Now, since we're working with humans, and humans are very variable, we're not inbred mouse lines that we can control everything. They're out there living their life, they're doing their thing. We want to be able to understand and capture what's the variability that's going on if we want to understand this link. So we need to ask questions. And so we give our participants a battery of all types of questions that you can think of. And when you start breaking it down, it starts to feel like you're in the doctor's office. We're asking questions about do you have other concerns? What are your medications? Anything that we can think of that might have a relationship and might affect our experiment. Now, because we're starting to ask all of these questions about protected health data, one of the big things that we do at this point is that we have to follow HIPAA compliance. Now, HIPAA ensures that the way that we store and deal and share any sort of data, even before sharing publicly, but internally, we have to protect the participants' privacy. This includes things like de-identifying the data so that a person cannot be identified by the data that they share with us, but also it includes things like storing it in secure places. So at this collection point, these are some of the considerations that we have in mind. Now for the second part of the Be Well study, the mindfulness intervention. As I mentioned, for Be Well, we're trying to understand, can a mobile app be effective in trying to help with depression symptoms? And the app that we have, that we're using, is one that was actually developed on campus. And it's free, so if you want to try it, you can. It's called the Healthy Minds Program. Now, the kind of data that we can start collecting from this, remembering our bigger question, we can start collecting data such as overall app usage, time spent with the app, time spent meditating on the app, time of day, and all of these types of information that might be helpful in addressing our bigger question. Now, one of the big things that comes up here at this point is that we need to get, again, the participants' permission to actually collect this data. And if you download this app, you'll actually see that even if you're not part of the study, there is an option that always asks you, can we keep track of your data? Now, the last aspect of BeWell is the microbiome. And so for this, what we're collecting are stool samples. And we're collecting it at 2 different time points. And what we're trying to figure out from this is what we want to find out is what the microbes are doing, and also what microbes are there. And at this point, I want to take a little bit more time, because the microbiome is the part of the project that I spend the most time on, to show with you and go into a little bit more detail about what it takes to collect this type of data. So the first step is sample collection. What are we collecting? We're collecting stool. Now, this is a fully remote study that we are collecting across 50 states. And we have an option of either sending our participants these large boxes that are filled with styrofoam. Inside is a Tupperware container that the participants will fill, they'll freeze, they'll pack it back up, and they'll overnight it to us. Now, remember at the very beginning, I told you at every point of the data's life cycle, there is a decision point. We have to make a decision, and there's a cost to the decision that we make. If we go this route, this is great. We get a lot of sample, which means we maximize the participant's effort. We get a lot of sample so that we can ask many different types of questions long term. We're also able to isolate the bacteria from the stool samples in case we decide, oh, that bacteria is super interesting and we want to find out more. But there's a con. These boxes need to be shipped overnight to us, or the sample integrity degrades, and then we can't trust the data as much. The other con is we're hoping to get 2,000 samples. These are a lot of boxes, right? So our alternative, and the method that we chose, looks like this. Inside of these small boxes are a commercial kit that actually this participant collects a piece of stool, puts it in there, and there's a special buffer that stabilizes the sample and stabilizes the DNA. And this, we're not worried about sample integrity degrading over time, but the con is we get small amounts of sample and we're not able to isolate the microbes afterwards. We just get DNA. But a pro is it's small. It's also a little bit more manageable. And since we never see the participants in person, this is more feasible. But you can kind of see that was a decision we had to make that affects the long-term type of data that we have overall. So the next step with the microbiome is once we receive the samples, we need to store them. And you can imagine we need a lot of freezer room. So for many of these studies, what we have in that picture is actually our freezer farm downstairs, rooms full of -80s that are maintained constantly, that we can then store the samples long term. Now, you might not think of a sample as being data, but it really is. So even though we might not use all of the sample in this one experiment, keeping a hold of it for long term will allow us to ask future questions and allow other researchers to ask future questions if they want to use the data that we've collected. So once we've collected the samples and stored it, since we're interested, remember, in BeWell in trying to understand how does the function of the microbiome change in the taxonomy, what we're doing next is that we're sequencing the samples, we're extracting the DNA and we're sequencing it so we find out, we're able to address these questions. Now, this is a highly computationally expensive part of the processing step. So to give you a context of when I say highly computationally expensive, what that looks like is if I were to take one sample and run it the processing from beginning to end on my laptop, it may take up to 480 hours. And so what we end up having to use in the picture here is actually the CHDC servers downstairs. So that's this campus-wide computer resource that allows us to do this analysis on a much more manageable timescale. All right, so we've planned the experiment data collection, we've collected, we processed it, now we get to analyze it. So how do we analyze this data? So if we take the microbiome data, the analysis and processing, I would argue, kind of merge into one step. And if you look at all the interim steps of processing and analyzing the data, you have to filter, clean reads, assemble, bin, and then finally you get a data table that you can do some sort of statistics. At every single one of these steps, there are at least, at minimum, 3 different algorithms or programs that you can use, which are all valid, and it's up to the researcher to pick which method. But the problem is that depending on which program you use, that might influence your final output. And so the challenge that we have here is one of reproducibility. And then when we think about at what stage do we share the data, do we share the rawest form, or do we share one that's slightly analyzed with a specific pipeline? What we need to do is always be able to have good documentation so that all of the potential variability and biases that happen are accounted for. Now, when we consider the survey data, there's a different set of factors that we have to consider when thinking about the fuzziness or uncertainty that might be introduced into the data. So survey data is a little bit more manageable. So you can take your surveys, collate it and codify it into some sort of data table and pick your statistical analysis of choice. But the surveys are dependent on human memory. Now, if you think back to the time that you went to the doctor's office and they asked you, in the last 2 weeks, did you do X? And you're thinking, you're sitting, and you're like, well, I think so. That's the fuzziness that comes into the data here. It's trying to trust our memory and our participants' memory. And that's where we have some uncertainty. So remember, going back to one of the questions that we have in Be Well, we can start asking and starting to address them. One question we had was, does the mindfulness intervention have an effect on the microbiome and depression symptoms? And so we can start pulling at all the different types of data that we've collected along the way to start answering these types of questions that we had in the beginning. And so far, what we found, if we just look at community composition, so which microbes are there, what we're able to see is that the mindfulness intervention does have an effect on the community, which is kind of exciting. And then when we take a closer look, we see that it's specific microbes that seem to be driving these differences. And when we look at how these microbes might be changing over time, it's not just all microbes are increasing. There's the specific microbes, some of them are increasing in abundance and decreasing in abundance. And we can then start making the link that maybe these changes in these microbes' abundances can be linked to what we're seeing as the increase of, or the decrease of depression symptoms, so the depression improving over time. So here we have depression at time point 1, and we can see at time point 2 in our 2 intervention groups, we're actually seeing a decrease in depression scores. So we've analyzed the data, and now we're getting ready to share and store it. But now we have the question of, we had these 3 different aspects of Be Well. What do we share? We had the survey data, the microbiome data, and all of the app usage data. One option is we can just compile it into paper and share it out. But like I said in the beginning, that's a very one-dimensional part of the data, right? If we really look at Be Well in its totality, we'll end up having about 2 terabytes of data. That's not going to be represented in a single publication. And to give you an aspect of what 2 terabytes could look like, if one letter is a byte, and in 1 page of text is a kilobyte. One book of 200 pages is a megabyte, so that 1 terabyte ends up being about 4 million books. So we'll have to find a way to share 8 million books with everybody if we want to share it, and we have to store it. And that's a challenge that Cameron will tell us about. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. I can hear myself. I answered that question. Cool. Hello, everyone. I am Cameron Cook. I am the Data and Digital Scholarship Manager and Chair of Research Data Services for the libraries. And I'm going to try to do a really brief dive into why is data sharing and data access so complicated, and how do people like me help? So we talked about all this data that we have, and a publication is going to be coming out, and so we want to share it. But I want to back up a little bit and talk a little bit more explicitly, even though Brian introduced it, as to why do we care about sharing? Like, what value is there in doing all this work to share data? So first, it's an investment. Data is valuable. We just heard about all of the work that goes into all of this collection and production of data, and that has human time and effort behind it, as well as resources that have gone into the collection and production of this data. That's an investment that we want to maximize. We want to see future potentials from that data. It's also just good science. So if we have a publication and we have the data that underlies the findings of that publication, that enables reproducibility and transparency. And what that means is that you could verify that you come to the same conclusions and same results as the author of that paper. I also want to emphasize it's not just us, it's not just researchers that get value from this. So when we put data out into the world, there's a lot of other people that can benefit, and it benefits our communities directly. Governments use this, nonprofits use this. Our data is really valuable to people beyond academia. So we know we want to share. You're all bought in. We're all sharing now. Cool. So how do we do that? We can just put it on a website, right? Like next to the cats, there's going to be the data set. In actuality, the secret about the internet is it's actually bad at forever. It is not, you can't just throw it up on a website. That website might not be around forever. Websites take money, they take people, they take time. There's care and feeding behind them. When someone stops paying for a website, it's gonna go away. Someone might just get a wild hair and change that page or the link or delete the content. So it isn't persistent. And you can think about when an investigator retires, anything about them at the institution gets archived, it goes away, and that includes a website. So we run into this first problem of persistency, and we need persistency for data to be findable and accessible, getting back to FAIR here. Our next problem is if we just throw stuff up wherever we want on our website, we run into the problem that humans are messy. We do try our best to give us credit, but we think we're geniuses all the time, and however we describe something and how we've named our variables, everyone else is totally gonna get. And so if we do that though, we're relying on people understanding us even though we use words differently, and we might have done something really complicated that they would never be able to parse. And so we run into this problem of needing standards and needing meaning around our data for it to be interoperable with other people's data and for it to be reusable by other people's data. We can't just describe it however we want. This gets back to metadata. So we're already running into problems with FAIR, accessibility, interoperability, how we describe it, how we find it, but there's even more problems. So we run into ethics and technical things. So if we want to throw stuff up on a website, you have to first ask the question, can your data even be open? Is it sensitive? And it's okay if it is. There are other ways to share data then. It just needs access procedures and mechanisms to secure and protect it because other people can responsibly access it. It just maybe shouldn't be open. There's also a lot of other outputs that go alongside data. There's code and software and protocols, all sorts of things that could be valuable to other researchers. Where are those things gonna live, and how are they gonna reference your data? They need to be interlinked and talk to one another. There's also just technical needs. So it's very easy to throw a spreadsheet up on a website, but if we get into the sizes of data that we've been talking about, that gets a lot more complicated. So we run into a lot more issues as we start to explore this. We also just don't want to be thinking about anything I've said so far at the point of sharing. That's not when we want people to be engaging with this. You want to start with it at the time of planning of the project, and there are best practices throughout this entire life cycle that we've been talking about that help make sure that your data at the point of sharing, when we get there eventually, is understandable and meaningful and usable to others. So I've named a lot of problems, but I also want to keep building on the problems, I guess. We don't exist in a vacuum. Research is global. So far this whole night have been talking about one researcher and one lab at this one institution in this one data set. But at this one institution, we have thousands of researchers, and they have lots of data sets, and they're all very different from what we've been talking about. And we're just one of many institutions in a global research community, all of who are also trying to share their data and communicate with other researchers, and they're navigating these issues too. So this is a really big problem. So what do we do? I've talked about we can't just put data anywhere. It has all kinds of needs. Researchers have to think about it throughout the entire project, surprise. And then there's a whole world of data out there. So how does that eventually become fair data? And the secret is people. People make fair possible. So there is this whole invisible layer that you don't get to see of people like me and all of my colleagues that are behind the scenes that are helping researchers navigate all of the problems that I've talked about. They're the ones building technical solutions, thinking about standards, providing resources, partnering. They're also the ones who look at all of the problems I've been talking about in light of this whole ecosystem of research and higher ed and federal policies and all the things we're beholden to. It's this very complex topic. And the way I've been talking about it tonight is pretty stripped back, but it's really, really complicated. And so we need people who can see all of that and then all of the details. So that's what we do. That is why a researcher like the one we just heard from might come talk to us. So what do we do? Very briefly, data and digital scholarship at the library is what people like us do. Our whole purpose is to help researchers steward their research data and digital projects throughout the entire life cycle, and it's all about fair. We want to ensure their work is understandable, reproducible, and accessible to others. And so how we do that, we do a lot of things. I'm just picking two, but two that are very salient for what we're talking about tonight. We provide data sharing solutions, and there's a couple ways we do that. Just to pick two, we have an institutional repository that we do manage called Minds at UW that openly and freely shares and disseminates scholarly outputs from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We actually support the whole system as well. So we have the institutional repository, which just the Madison portion has 14,000 items in it. That's not all data. It's also preprints, technical reports, lots of other scholarly items. We also provide membership to another data repository called Dryad. So we enable our researchers to deposit for free in this trusted repository that is also open access. And there are about, since we've joined, there are about 500 data sets from UW-Madison in Dryad that anyone can access, anyone in the world. So we provide data sharing solutions. We also provide research data services, which I'll talk about a bit more in another slide or two. I want to go back to data repositories and data sharing solutions really quickly because it's the solution to a lot of the things I've talked about so far, and I want to kind of hit on them in case you haven't heard of them before. So data repositories, you can kind of think of them as similar to a library. It is a place that is centralized and committed to the long-term access of information, in this case, data. And they have infrastructure and solutions and standards, workflows, policies, all that cool stuff to address all of the tricky things we've talked about so far with data access. And key, again, getting back to people, they have professionals who can help answer those questions and help researchers use our services and develop all the technical solutions to how we do this stuff well. So that's what data repositories do and why we provide those data sharing solutions. Getting back to research data services, so as I said, I planted earlier that sharing is just one part of the life cycle, and we have to be thinking about it the whole time. So we also provide a service that thinks about the whole life cycle, and we're trying to help researchers across that entire life cycle. So research data services, our home is in the libraries, but we have folks from all over campus. We're an interdisciplinary, completely free resource to anyone in the campus community, and we talk about research data management and sharing. So we provide a lot of support. We help with data management plans and planning for all of this stuff that we've talked about. We advise on data sharing in repositories. We provide education and best practices. We also collaborate with our partners on campus all over to think about projects, initiatives, policies, resources that can help fill some of these gaps that we've been talking about today about why it's so hard to access and share data. So that's Research Data Services, and that was my crash course in data access and how libraries help. And now I'll turn it over to our conversation.
I did really want to say that I completely forgot my acknowledgements, and BWell is a giant project that is multi-institutional, and yes, I want to acknowledge them that it takes a lot of people to get BWell to work, but I forgot that slide.
So you guys are lucky that my laptop took so much time at the beginning that otherwise I'm having fun. We'll be here all night. So we started off the evening talking about data democracy, right? Democratizing data, making it available out to the public. And we went through the example of one particular lab. We talked about one particular institution and the services that are provided. Maybe to start with Margaret, what does data democracy, and when you think of public access and making it available, what does that mean to you as a scientist?
As a scientist, to me, it means that if data is fully available, that means I could go somewhere really easily, download it, and not have any issues at all, and I could play with it and understand it. Yeah.
And particularly for you, Cameron?
Oh, that's so complicated. Because it boils down to, I just want to support all of the things that enable you to do that. But it's really, really complicated, and I could go on and on about like ethics and public versus open and all of those things, but I'll retain myself. I'll hold on to that.
Yeah. And in fact, we've spent all evening talking about how wonderful sharing data is and the big high-minded concepts. It's not an easy process. And in fact, it's not even a process that's necessarily well accepted within the scientific community. It hasn't been until even within about the last 20 years or so that scientific data has been funded by taxpayers, has even been mandated to be made available in terms of the papers that we write. And it wasn't even until 2022 that the federal government mandated that the data sets that publish and underpin those publications have some plan for being made available. And that mandate was put out, and they're still in the rulemaking process. So open data is particularly hard. Maybe Cameron, do you want to talk a little bit the challenges and why would a scientist ever resist opening up their data? Why did it take until 2022?
Oh man, yes. So it's really complicated. We have to. That gets into questions about incentives and reward structures and what has been rewarded for academic sharing for a long time, which historically it has not been data. It's been the publication and many other things. You also have the amount of investment researchers put into their research and their data. That becomes really hard to part with. They worry about scooping. Scooping meaning that another researcher might derive an insight they didn't see in that data before the researcher who produced it could find that themselves. They worry about getting that maximum value from that data that they put into it before they share it out in the world, and those are really real concerns, and I don't want to minimize those at all, but there are ways we can address it. So yeah, it's how people have been rewarded. There's all the investment they make that can put resistance up for people in data sharing.
Yeah. Margaret, do you want to?
Oh, just to echo that, I feel one thing that might not you've said it might not be initially obvious, is that a lot of career progression or like degrees, like you're working on your PhD or you're working on your master's, it's all dependent on the data that you generate. And so that's part of the push and pull of like, if I share it, will I not get my PhD because someone scooped it? Because now my analysis is redundant because they were able to do it faster. Or will I not get tenure because, you know, another bigger group was able to get there quicker? So it's that human aspect of like, researchers, even though we try to be, you know, the best that we can be, but there is that part of it it makes it competitive. And yeah, if we find ways to remove that competitiveness from it, it would be easier.
I know within my own little area of computer science, I'm often even happy or pleased if somebody looks at my data. Please, please, please look at my data. But another aspect, at least for me, is the fact that this is hard work. Every morning you have to wake up and decide, am I going to spend, you know, how am I going to spend the next 12 hours? Am I going to spend those hours labeling the data, making the things I've done easier for others to look at and reuse, even though it won't benefit me or my group? Or am I going to look at the next interesting project? That, you know, this is often even about human time and bandwidth. That you know, it's a high idea. It's, you know, like many principles, things that we strive for, but there's often reasons it's not as easy as it looks. Maybe one more question for Margaret to talk a little bit about ethics. So it used to be that somebody's gene sequence was considered de-identified. You know, you can't do anything with it besides maybe look at the different attributes. And about 10 years ago, there were various papers that showed that, in fact, you can take somebody's genetic information and go to some of these big databases and re-identify and have actual, that it becomes identifiable health information. So data changes. It's not just something static in the freezer in the basement. It can be reused. It can be reused in places people didn't think before. How do you view ethics and think about the dangers of reusability for the sorts of things you're collecting on people?
It's a hard question because it's like you want to protect, because we have this social contract with our participants, especially in these studies, of like, we're asking in good faith all of these things, and how we can't predict the future, but it's like, if we can do the best that we can right now and think about if it reaches the point that genomes can be identifiable, is there a way that we can still provide some level of protection when things change? I think that's pretty much the way that I think about it. It's like, am I doing the best that I can right now with what I can do? And being willing and open when things change to still go backwards and retroactively try and fix things to keep that social contract with the public when they do engage with science.
Wonderful. I think I saw a question out there in the audience. I think we have a couple times for others to. I think we have a mic.
I was going to add to that question, who might buy that data in the future? That, you know, Hollywood is a good example of films that were made in the early part of the century when the science was new are now, you know, you can see Fred Astaire dancing with a vacuum cleaner, or, you know, you don't know how that data can be done when corporate buy it, profit from it, and then use that extraction, because they're not using the data itself. They can extract their own, and then that's their own product. And then that can be sold as a library. You're inventing something that you can sell.
You can go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very real concern and a really important point. And so this is where I want to mention how important investment and people are to solving these problems. So When I think about that from my perspective and what I do in the libraries, my immediate thought is, well, if we're talking about data that we're concerned about its potential future uses, that's probably data that's not appropriate to be open. So where do we put it, and what mechanisms do we put around it to limit those potential future uses? So in that case, it might come with a data use agreement that anyone who accesses it has to sign that says it cannot be used for X, Y, Z, whatever the reasons are. And that's something that you then have that contract with that person who's going to use that data. So that's one way you can do it. But these are really complicated topics, and it's hard for me as just a librarian who knows what I know to navigate these things. So I rely on people like HIPAA privacy officers and cybersecurity and IT and all of these people around me who know all of that other stuff so that we can come up with a solution that protects data over time. And we do the best that we can now, knowing what we know.
And maybe to give an example, one thing we're seeing, it's the tip of everybody on New York Times and Washington Post, is the rise of AI. And this is one where we are seeing people go back to data sets that people thought were useless, right? I work with people in imaging and single cell data, and somebody might say, oh, the control sample in that was all messed up. You know, everything's in focus, the images were fine, but the experiment was horrible. It's failed data, put it on the shelf, it's worthless. And often people now doing machine learning will come back and say, that can help train models to identify aspects and features of cells. So we are starting to see some really data hungry researchers, even without talking about some of the ethical concerns of turning that to commercial entities that can derive all sorts of value that wasn't expected within the same field. Normally you think of data reuse as somebody scooping you, somebody else doing the same sort of science. And one of the maybe positive ways to view machine learning is you can see the data reuse coming from all sorts of angles that you had never considered before. So there's lots of possibilities along with some of the ethical and dangers of the data reuse in that case. I think we have a microphone.
That stimulated a question, but also I'm going to have two questions. The importance, though, what you just said is the metadata, because if the metadata aren't labeling that picture either good or bad, you're using data and not really realizing what it could imply down the road. So how much of the metadata is out there in these systems? And secondly, for Cameron or for all of us, when I went to graduate school, we didn't even have spreadsheets. But what I notice now, even today, when I talk to people in the lab, is they only have spreadsheets. They don't even think about what they're going to do with their data, and they're not trained to think about it. They're essentially clueless, especially certain sciences. I won't name names, but this is a big problem, I think, because we're generating data and it's going to wind up in files just like it did 40 years ago. So is there any emphasis on campus to start training in data handling?
Yeah.
Yes, and I would love there to be more. So we're doing the best we can with the outreach we can. There is definitely opportunity for us to be reaching graduate students earlier. We've tried actually doing some things at the undergraduate level, and that we found was hit and miss, but that was a different time. So yes, I think what it comes down to, I guess my refrain is people tonight. We need people and resources to be able to do that outreach, and also to build the buy-in, to get the time in classrooms, and be able to build those structures that reach students at that point and become part of their training. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's not something comprehensive yet. So I danced around that, but hopefully that answers that.
And maybe on your second question about data size and areas of science that are still in spreadsheets, I love those areas. I work with some of the biggest of the big data science. I work with a particle accelerator out at CERN that has just floods and floods of data. And it's boring because those people are already there. They've already have their way of thinking. They're already set. there's nothing more exciting than a student or God help us, even a PI or professor who's moving up that ladder. And I really believe the quality of science is really reflected every time you move up that order of magnitude, every time you get 10 times bigger. So even if your 10 times bigger is going from the spreadsheet to analysis that takes over your laptop, or from a laptop to a whole server, that's where the science happens, and that gets me more excited. And to be honest, it's more difficult from the computer science standpoint. How do you interact and teach and make it accessible than it is working with the big folks that have all the money and all the fame and glory.
My question is, do you copyright your work?
Not really. So when you publish, there is some sort of publisher copyright that exists, but that's a journal specific. But when we are sharing it, we hope that anyone using our data will attribute where that data came from, and they will not claim it as their own, but there's no like strict copyright for some data sets.
There's so many models.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful diversity. Sometimes publishers require you to give them the copyright as part of the publication process. But one really important thing about publicly funded data that on all the grants, say, that come to the university, it says the publications from this project have to be put in a publicly accessible archive. And there are the questions about openness and data ethics and protection, and those are covered. But if there's none of those, it has to be made publicly available. At least to me, that's important. And making it not only available to the society that provided the funding for it, we're just now starting to take that next step, saying not just the publications, but the data sets, which are challenging. There's even equity issues that not every university is large enough to be able to afford a great team like Cameron's. It comes with all sorts of challenges, but at least on my side, I feel it's fundamentally the right thing for us to be doing. Maybe one more question, because we started a little late, sorry.
Cameron mentioned data use agreements. I'm really curious, has a university ever sued anyone for violating these?
Don't know. If they have, they probably wouldn't tell me. So that's a great question that I might ask around and see if I can hear anything, because I don't know. I would assume if there was a major violation that potentially affected privacy and confidentiality, we would probably pursue that, but I don't know. I'm not legal.
Sure.
I don't know of anyone being sued, but I'm sure there are many things that have been taken down. Like if data, you find your data set being shared somewhere else where it's not supposed to be because of the data use agreement, it can come down.
You know, my observation is almost all, kind of, yes, every place has a few bad apples. Academics really take intellectual property and ownership and these sorts of issues fairly seriously. When I look at the faculty and the students and trainees at UW-Madison, they believe in attributing to the right people. They believe in following the letters of the agreement. People take these seriously. It's part of the trust in that social contract. And I don't know of any juicy lawsuits. It would be a fun war story to tell, but as far as I could tell, I see people really taking these sorts of things seriously. All right. Do we have time for one more?
One more question?
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
Is there a conflict with anonymization of data and for the user to submit their algorithms? And when you talked about moving on, being a life member of the IEEE, they finally stopped using the image of the Playboy for digitizing images. So we do move on.
Yeah. but slowly. Say a lot of those images were started in the 1970s, and I think IEEE changed its policy this year. But yeah, these algorithms to evolve. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so a bit on anonymization. Again, this goes back to the IRB that Margaret mentioned. Anytime there is any sort of identifiable data, PHI, HIPAA protected, anything that falls in these broad categories that we've decided as a society should be restricted in their access or otherwise need to be protected, this goes through review boards. There are stringent rules on what can be done. There are policies of at what point is it de-anonymized, that these change over time and they get often stricter over time. I gave that example of DNA sequencing used to be viewed as anonymized, and it's no longer viewed as anonymized. So this is part of the internal review process of the university's system, and it's a fundamental part of any research that can touch humans, that they need to decide what can be kept, what are the procedures for anonymizing. If the research can't fundamentally be anonymized or de-identified, what are the restrictions and technical safeguards that have to be put in place? These aren't easy things to get past through review boards. I mean, how long did it take for BeWell to go through the IRB
couple of
process?
months. Yeah.
Yeah, it's months of work. These are ones that you don't mess with the review board. They will get you if you don't do the things they say.
Yeah, and so just to build on that, there's a lot of protections in place. This is also a continuing area of expertise that continues to grow as anonymization and de-identification. Honest brokers, it's a role at an institution. They're experts at that, and those resources are important as we share more and more data for researchers to be able to leverage so that they, can anonymize and de-identify in the most appropriate ways. This is also where I want to lean on the fact that, again, when we talk, I guess I didn't say this is normally my little soapbox. When we talk about public access and availability to data, it's a spectrum. So it's open to moderated and restricted, and that's all still available. That data is still available by request. Something that's not fully open isn't suddenly not available. And as we share more and more data that is potentially sensitive and needs more anonymization or de-identification, we have to lean more on repositories that have restricted and moderated access mechanisms so that they can vet requests and uses around the data so that it's not just openly available and someone can't come scrape it and do something with it. So we have to have the spectrum of infrastructures to enable data access and sharing over time.
All right. Thank you very much to our speakers for enlightening evening. Thank you, audience.